This is ContraZoom, where we go back and forth about film. I'm your host, Dakota Arsenault. On today's show, we are continuing our A24 Retrospective series. This is our 32nd edition of the series, and you can listen to recent episodes 290, A24 Retrospective The Souvenir, 288, A24 Retrospective Mojave, or go all the way back to episode 108, A History of A24 Films, to get the full backstory on the company. Today we're covering 2015's The Witch, directed by Robert Eggers, starring Anya Taylor-Joy and Ralph Ineson, which is about a family in New England who is plagued by disaster as they may or may not be living next to woods where witches habitate. Today we have possibly the busiest person I know on. He hosts two different podcasts, including the Movie Draft podcast and the aptly named 24 Minutes of A24. He has his own YouTube channel, writes for Agents of Fandom, has a newsletter, and I'm sure I'm forgetting things, along with being a member of the Cascadia Film and Television Critics Association. So welcome to the show for the very first time, Ethan Simi. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. Thank you for having me. I get tired listening to you talk about all the things that I do. So I don't really know how I make it happen, but those are all accurate. And I am just stoked to be here talking about The Witch with you.
Yeah, I'm definitely missing things that you do, because I feel like every week you've got some
Sure.
new venture going on that I'm like, Ethan's got something else? Where's he have the time
Yeah,
for this?
I feel like that is generally the case. The time is between the hours of 7:30 when my children sleep and 6 a.m. when they wake up. I just don't sleep. As you know, right before we started potting, I started my first cup of coffee at almost 4 p.m. in the afternoon. So I have no sleep schedule over here.
Love it. Amazing. Well, yeah, I'm really excited to have you on. I feel like I've known you now for almost a year.
Yeah.
And you've someone I want to have on. We tried a couple times at TIFF. It didn't end up working out, things like that. But I'm excited that we finally found the time today.
Yeah, I'm very glad. You're right. I think we've tried to link up a couple of times, and it just hasn't worked out. But I am honestly very excited and very grateful that the episode I'm on is about The Witch, because I have a very complicated history with this film. So I'm excited that we're in a safe space here and we can kind of dissect that.
Oh, I've definitely noted your complicated history with this film, and I will be calling you out ever so slightly
Oh,
later.
great. I can't wait.
But because you're a first-time guest on this episode, I'm going to ask you the usual A24 4 questions that I ask every first-time guest on this series. And it's going to be really interesting because, like I said, you also host a podcast called The 24 Minutes of A24. And after we kind of go through these questions, I'd love to kind of maybe follow up a little bit with the origin of that podcast and sort of how that relates to your history with this company. So let's get started with the very first question, which I'm sure is going to be very hard for you because I'm sure, like me, you've seen a good chunk of them. What are your top 3 A24 films?
Yeah, you're right. So I do host 24 Minutes of A24. So I do have like kind of a little, personal relationship with this company and distribution company. I've seen what I have logged on Letterboxd in my A24 ranked list is 110 A24 films. So my top 3 are what I would consider pretty basic, unfortunately. That, like, I'm not really pulling any deep cuts here or being like, this is actually the best A24 movie. I think within my top 10, I have some really interesting picks, but my top 3 are pretty basic. So I'll start with number 3. My number 3 is Past Lives. It's like undoubtable the power of Past Lives and Celine's song and my sad boy John Magaro. I love to see him just being sad in movies and on screen. Past Lives is really something special, and it's interesting because all of these top 3 are fairly recent, which I don't want to say is like attributed to recency bias because I've seen all of them many, many times now. But I do think that's fascinating, just to say the least. My number 2 is a little movie you might know called After Sun. Probably the saddest film I've ever seen in my life. I am the dad of a 6 and a 4-year-old daughter. So I have 2 girls. This movie obviously about a dad and a daughter on a holiday in Turkey, and I think that this is the most I have ever felt represented on screen. Coming from a middle-aged cisgender white male, which is that's a thing in and of itself. But like being a young dad to a young child, or and that relationship and seeing your life pass by as their life continues on. It's a very interesting dichotomy to like live with, because I did just turn 30 this past year. So I'm very much in the zone of After Sun,
Mhm.
where I'm just very, very feeling that movie. And then my number one A24 movie has been number one ever since I've seen it. Every time I rewatch it, sticks to number one. It is Uncut Gems. That's my movie. That's my thing. I have a tattoo of the Furby that Howie tries to sell on my arm. I think this movie's incredible, and I just think it's the greatest thing that's ever been put on screen. Quite honestly. So I don't know if you want to like get much deeper than that, but Uncut Gems is my thing. That is my lifetime bit. That is my go-to A24 movie. That is as good as it gets.
I mean, I'm not surprised in the slightest. I've been listening to
Sure.
your podcast now for a year now, and I don't think an episode goes by where you don't mention Uncut Gems on the Movie Draft podcast, even
true.
when it has
Yeah.
nothing to do with Uncut Gems.
It's true. Yeah, 100%. The thing that is so difficult about this movie is a lot of the really good lines are significantly inappropriate for public conversation. Like I can't just like bust out some of these Howie lines.
Mhm.
So, yeah, on my pod I always try to circle back to the manna from heaven that is Uncut Gems.
Love it. And then, briefly touching on After Sun here,
Mhm.
what do you find connects you with this story? Because I know you're talking about relating how you're a young father, you've got two young girls.
Yep.
Do you worry that the journey that the daughters go on in that film, is that like something that you're concerned of, like, oh, how are my children going to view me when they're older, when they're adults? Is that something that really affects you?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, but I think After Sun unlocked this idea that as I neared 30, and this movie came out in 2022, so I was 28, and I was already substantially undergoing some big existential crises about, okay, 30 is coming. What does that
Hmm.
mean for me? What does that mean as a father? Because at the time, when I saw this movie for the first time, my daughters were 4 and 2, and so it was very this new relationship that was happening. And I think what After Sun unlocks, and the thing that I grab onto the most distinctly, is that I am a person and my daughters are a person. And that might seem really simple if you're not a father, not a parent, but it is a very difficult identification to grasp, at least for me, to understand that my children don't just see a dad, they see a person. And I can
Hmm.
also still be a person. I can be a person that says, I got to go podcast with my friend Dakota. I got to go check out this movie tonight. I got to go hang out with some friends, have a great night with your mom. And that is very difficult as a parent, because this idea of maintaining your individuality while also being the best dad that you can be is a constant push and pull. And so, you know, obviously the final 10 minutes and specifics of this film really capture that. Seeing the child grow up and seeing these ideas of what they think of their father, and that
Hmm.
idea, it really, really messes me up. So I can't like think about it for too long, or else I'll just like enter an emotional coma.
Hmm. Okay.
Yeah,
One follow-up question.
of
Are
course.
you still able to listen to Under Pressure?
No, no, absolutely not. I cannot do that. I refuse. I can't. It's just not. Yeah, it's never gonna happen.
Fair enough.
And like After Sun is one of those movies that like I at least have to be emotionally prepared if I plan to rewatch it. I can't just be
Hmm.
like sitting at home being like, "Yo, let's fire up After Sun again." One of my faves. It's like I need to know 30 days in advance when I'm
Hmm.
watching After Sun, because I need to
Yeah.
prep for that journey. Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, hopefully we won't make any more emotional here. So, second question, and I'm very curious about this one.
Mhm.
What was your introduction to A24?
Yeah. So, funnily enough, my introduction to A24 is tied to Uncut Gems. So, really, my start with movies is kind of tied to my introduction to A24. I had no idea who A24 was, didn't know really anything about their history, their distribution. I didn't even know what that meant in terms of movies. And so when Uncut Gems came out in December of 2019, alongside Joker, these were two movies that came out. I wasn't really into movies before this, and I kind of hate that this is my origin story, but as time goes on and progresses, like I have to be proud that this is my movie origin story, my A24 origin story. Um, I don't know which one I saw first in theaters, but I think I saw them like day, back to back, like one on a, whatever, a Wednesday and the next one on a Thursday.
Mm-hmm.
I know when I saw Joker, I saw it with a friend of mine at the time, and I was blown away because I had not seen Taxi Driver, I had not seen King of Comedy. I had no reference points for that film. And so I was like, holy crap, movies are crazy. And then at that point, I was like, we should start a podcast and talk about movies. And so that really, and talk about Joker. And that really started my first podcast 5 years ago. I've long been, debunked now. That pod, rest in peace. But that was that. And then I saw Uncut Gems at essentially the same time. Very similar. If you think about the ending of Uncut Gems and the ending of Joker, it's a very similar vein of we're going to take a hard swerve left and we're going to make you gasp. And I remember when I saw Uncut Gems, I stood up in my theater and I was just literally physically in shock of like, wow, that happened? I can't believe it. And so anybody that hasn't seen Uncut Gems, I don't want to say in particulars what it might be, but that was really the beginning. And I was like, okay, I love this movie. I'm attached to this movie. What are some other movies like it? What is this? What is A24? What does this mean? And then basically from there started the big long journey of hitting the big pieces, right? Midsommar, Moonlight, Lady Bird, all of like the big things that you're just kind of like, you Google, you're like, what are the best A24 movies? And like that kicked off that adventure 5 years ago now. Yeah.
That's so interesting because I feel like a lot of people's introduction to A24s, they don't realize they've been introduced to it. And so usually when I ask this question, they'll be like, oh yeah. And looking back on the list, I realized I'd probably seen about 3 or 4 A24 films. And then it wasn't until X film, Y film, whatever. And they're like, oh, I'm starting to recognize this logo. What else have they done? Oh, they've also done this one from a few years ago. Oh, I also saw this one. So that's sort of interesting that Uncut Gems was the one that really led you into the rabbit hole to sort of dig more into this company and what they were doing.
Yeah, it's super interesting because I'm pretty sure, and now you have me interested, like I want to do my research. There's no really good way to filter Letterboxd to say like what's the order that I've seen logged all these A24 movies. But I would not be surprised if after I saw Uncut Gems, Good Time was the next movie that I saw, because obviously you're like, okay, what are these? What else do these guys make? They make Good Time. They make it for A24 as well. And then that kind of just, the ball continues to roll after that. So yeah, it was a really interesting, sporadic journey and introduction into A24.
Yeah. Interesting. All right. Well, then what director, dead or alive, would make a good A24 film?
Okay. So I am kind of cheating. And if you don't let me combine a director into a single person, that's okay. I'll choose one of them. But I just wrote down, and I kind of, again, I feel like I kind of went the easy route on this one, but it is so, like it makes so much sense in my brain, because you have the one end of A24 that is Uncut Gems and Good Time and Climax and all of these crazy movies. Then you have the other end that is, After Sun and Past Lives and First Cow and these other things that are very moving, emotional pieces of art. And so I thought, you know what? What if we could combine those? And then we could make a new director, and this person would be Yorgos Lanthimos combined with Noah Baumbach. What if we could just get super weird, really classic A24 style, like many of their films do, and then also include, the vibes and the aura of a mid-90s, a Minari, a Lady Bird. Like Baumbach is very much in that zone, and I know Baumbach's next film is essentially an adult coming-of-age story. Marriage Story is not really any different, depending on the way that you look at it. So kind of combining those ideas, I think would make a really good director. If I can't combine them, I'd be much more interested for Yorgos to make an A24 movie. I don't think he ever will, but I think it'd be fascinating.
Well, he did already. The Killing of the Sacred Deer.
Oh, right. The Killing of a Sacred Deer. Okay, I take it back then. Noah Baumbach. That's my answer.
And he's also done While We're Young.
Oh, this is terrible. I have failed you greatly. Oh my goodness. I literally have, oh my goodness. Okay. We got to go back to the drawing board. This is terrible. Listeners are probably like, who is this guy? He doesn't even know these movies. My goodness.
He hosted A24 pod?
Yeah, and he doesn't even know. That's the thing though. Like you forget. And a lot of these directors have done it so early that it's hard to remember what they've done.
It's interesting because with the both of them, they both had previous extensive careers, did one movie with A24, and have continued to make movies afterwards without A24. So it was almost just like using a sports analogy, someone signing like a 1-year contract with like this weird, Midwest team. You're like, why are you playing for them? And then they go back to the big leagues or whatever, exactly. The big cities.
Yeah. Can we? Well, Sofia Coppola has made one.
A couple, actually.
Can we get Adam McKay to make a movie?
It's
probably a really poor choice. People are probably groaning, but like I'm pretty pro Adam McKay, and I do feel like now with the release of the trailer for The Death of a Unicorn, that is like, it strikes me as very Adam McKay coded, that type of humor and that kind of a cast, and I feel like he could do good things. But I don't know why he would. He has money from Netflix. They let him make what he wants. I don't know what A24 could bring that something else doesn't, but could be interesting.
To quote one of your favorite movies, I would be interested to see if Adam McKay could rein it in a little bit and what that would be like.
Sure.
There's directors, like, we both love Christopher Nolan, and Oppenheimer is incredible, and his recent movies are incredible. But I'm kind of curious of what does a scaled back Nolan that he was doing at the beginning of his career look like today. Like, I still want to see that sort of thing from him. Denis Villeneuve, same deal. I want to see what's an enemy today for Denis Villeneuve. Yeah,
that's interesting that you mentioned Christopher Nolan, because I feel like what would that be like for him to go back to following, but like have I don't know, like the Brutalist style, right? Like $10 million to make a really interesting movie. I'd be fascinated to see that. People like that are on that level. I feel like you equate, Nolan and Spielberg and these guys. I just don't know if A24 will ever have the amount of cachet that it would take to like get them to do something. But you never know. I mean, 3 years ago, I would have been like, the A24 would never sign on for this kind of stuff. And look at where we are now. So
yeah, for sure. Okay. And then the last question, which I think you're uniquely qualified to answer. What makes an A24 film for you?
Yeah. I think an A24 film is interesting. There's a lot of discourse on film Twitter in general about like what A24 is. I do think it's important that people remember like A24 is just a company. They're just a distribution company. Like they have recently began, being a production company and making films. But from most of what I have heard from directors is that A24 does give a lot of free reign for what they do. I'm thinking specifically of like Jane Schoenbrunn and I Saw the TV Glow. They apparently had a very full run of show on their film. So there is a distinction, but for an A24 film, I feel like, again, it either dives into the fantastically strange or emotionally obliviating. I think those are like the two kind of prongs that A24 does, and they are still doing, and they still do very, very well. And I do think a lot of their movies, when you kind of pull back a little bit and maybe not look individually, but look as an entire filmography, many, many of these movies have a longevity that I don't think a lot of other distribution companies can really put a stamp on. Neon is getting there, and I think Neon is probably the closest competitor to an A24. But you talk about movies like A Ghost Story. Like this film came out in 2017, and it is as important now as it has ever been. And I think that's just interesting. So A24 always a little bit left or right of kind of, the very wide average path. But they know what they're looking for, and they do a good job of kind of keeping that aura in all of their films.
Yeah. I think that's a great answer, and one that I don't think we've heard someone touch on. I know sometimes people sort of touch on the. I don't think anyone has succinctly view the two prong
Mm.
ways that they mostly go about making movies or releasing movies. It's obviously not the only thing they do, but that is a big component of their style and their aura, basically. But I think that's a great way of describing it. So thank you.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I really do think that Everything Everywhere All at Once winning Best Picture specifically, I think that's a huge inflection point for A24 because they had Moonlight win prior to that. They had a lot of weird stuff prior to that, but Everything Everywhere takes the two prongs and melds them essentially, and is like, you can make a very weird movie that's also very timely and emotionally impacting. And so a lot of the projects moving forward have that idea kind of wrapped around them. So I think they've kind of stamped that as a very important moment in time for them as a brand, and are following that path forward.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, yeah, I mentioned earlier, I kind of want to know a little bit more about the history of, your 24 Minutes of A24 podcast. You mentioned that Uncut Gems was your eye-opening experience of leading you down the company, but then what made you decide that you want to do an entire podcast dedicated to them?
Yeah, so basically I had the one podcast. It was called Final Take, and it was me and a good friend. And we had on this other podcast called Three Films in a Podcast. These three hosts, we kind of joined up, made a pod together. Once my pod kind of disbanded, I had reached out to my now really good friend, my co-host of 24 Minutes of A24, Ben Lawhorn, and had been like, yo, I had a great time potting with you. Would you ever want to do something together in the future? He's like, yeah, absolutely. So we kind of tried to decipher and figure out what was of interest to us versus just like a general movie podcast. We both had a very busy schedule. So we're like, okay, can we find a niche that is like smaller pods? Can we do something that is 15 minutes or 24 minutes or half an hour? So we decided on 24 minutes, and we decided on A24 because Ben is a huge fan of movies like After Sun and Past Lives, but at the time was a huge fan of like Midsommar, Hereditary. He's a big Moonlight guy as well. So like we kind of felt like we had a grasp on like, okay, all of these movies are A24. For me, there was some really big stuff like Hereditary, Midsommar that I hadn't seen. That I was like, oh, this is great. Like if we make a podcast about this is wonderful because I'm finally going to get to watch this stuff. I can finally talk about it, and we can keep it short. Like we can make it fit our schedules. This is going to be wonderful. We did the first episode, and it was like, I think an hour and change. And we are like, well, that's not going to work. We can't do 24 minutes. So we kept the title and we scrapped that idea. And we're just like, well, we'll just talk about A24 movies. And at the time, if I remember correctly, it was like on the cusp of, I think we were like 1 year away from Everything Everywhere All at Once. So like we were really on the cusp of A24, what I would say like modern day exploding onto the scene as the distributor and the brand that they are. And we covered that entire Oscar season with Everything Everywhere, and have kind of deeply covered all of their new releases and things up until very recently. We're on a brief hiatus for the podcast for the holidays. But that is ultimately how the podcast started. And we had kind of just agreed like, okay, we're just going to talk about A24 because they're really interesting and they make fascinating content. And that was really it. I'm going back through and I'm trying to find, I'm looking through and seeing when our very first episode, because we are almost at 200 episodes and we're doing one a week. So we've been doing that pod for quite some time now. And so I'm trying to figure out what might have been one of our first kind of slates of episodes and when they released. Let's see. I'm almost to the beginning.
This is fascinating radio.
Yeah, this is great podcasting. Yeah. I mean, Uncut Gems episode 1. So I misspoke. Our first handful of episodes, it looks like we're around 30 minutes and we were trying our hardest. And I know there was a distinct inflection point where we were just like, this is not going to work. Like I have too much to say. But like I said, like Uncut Gems, good time, Ex Machina, Hereditary, Midsommar, mid 90s, Enemy. Like we covered some really big A24 stuff. All the way back in September of 2021 is when our first episode came out. So, and then we just kind of took off from there. We started covering Euphoria, and a lot of new releases, obviously during the pandemic and post-pandemic, that were going straight to streaming. And we had a really good time with that. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. So it's sort of interesting because this is now I believe, the 32nd installment of me doing this series. And for me, it was every week my show kind of covers something completely different. And I kind of felt like I needed something that was a little more anchory, where I was like, I need some sort of long running thing that's easy to do, because a lot of the time the episodes that I do require a lot of homework, a lot of preparation, and it's difficult to bring people on and be like, hey, can you watch like 10 movies? And whereas this was like, hey, I'm only going to focus on one movie. Yep. I can change up the guests frequently. I can invite people on. I'll have a structure. And for me, that's why I did this. And I remember when I was looking this idea up, it's been, I think, 2 or 3 years now I've been doing this specific series, looking into Spotify, just be like, A24, what's going on with that?
Yeah.
And there was very few things. I saw like film podcasts would like cover an A24 movie, but like there wasn't, I think I saw one dedicated A24 podcast, and it seemed really small and really niche. I don't know if I saw yours come up or not, but there wasn't a lot. And then recently, sometimes 6 months or ago, I decided to look it up again, and there's just been an explosion of A24 content.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's crazy. I think people really did like kind of grapple on over the last like 6 to 12 to 18 months for A24. And I think a lot more people are knowledgeable about like who A24 is and what they might represent. I find that interesting because I feel like the view of A24 now is the view that I had of A24 maybe like 2 years ago, where people are like, whoa, they make like some crazy stuff and like it's really interesting. And it's like, man, you guys should have been around 2.5 years ago, because they were doing crazier stuff, more interesting things, in my opinion. But yeah, I think that is just kind of what we had decided on as our thing. And we had just said like, cool, there's a lot here. They have, 180 plus movies now in their catalog, in their library. We'll never run out of episode ideas. Like, we can just cover this for a very long time. And on the podcast, we have done 2 years. We're taking this year off, but we have done 2 previous years covering the Oscars. So we kind of dip away from A24. And luckily enough, there has been an A24 movie nominated for Best Picture for the last, at least last year, if not the year prior as well. So we were able to kind of tie that all together and really make our interest in film kind of blossom, and use A24 as a catalyst for that.
Nice. Do you fear there seems to be a lot of chatter online about whether or not A24 is sort of jumping the shark or changing their priorities for the worse? Is that something that concerns you or worries you as they talk about expanding their budget and going for more populist material?
Yeah, for sure. It's a real interesting line, because like, I have no personal stake in A24. I got to be honest. Like, I don't give a shit what A24 does or makes or spends, or it doesn't matter to me. I'm just a recipient of their content, just like anybody else. I just so happen to talk about their content on a designated platform. It's no different than a YouTube channel or a TikTok account or anything where somebody grasps onto one singular item or idea. So this influx of their idea of like, let's make action movies and let's make some IP, some in-house IP, and like, let's do things like The Death of a Unicorn that has like Paul Rudd, Jenna Ortega, all these like popular people. I think that's the only way they can go. Like, I don't know if they can retain what they've managed for the last 5 years and keep it interesting and keep it fascinating, because the biggest issue that I think for them is exactly what you alluded to at the beginning of the episode, is like, these huge filmmakers, Denis, Noah Baumbach, Yorgos, they have moved on. Like, they are losing their stable of people because because A24 has a barrier. They have a glass ceiling that has not been broken yet. And so they're having to go to other people, like Helena Rain, now on her second film with Baby Girl with the brand. Alex Garland, they've still kind of got in the stables a little bit, and is kind of one of their key components. And so same with Ari Aster. So I think they can only go up and expand. Will it work for them? I'm nervous that they will cannibalize the brand that they've worked very hard to curate as like the auteur film bro brand
Mm-hmm.
by like attaching an A24 logo to like a TV show about Liverpool FC. I just don't know if that's their thing, but I get
Yeah.
it. Like, I get it. You got to put your stamp on stuff. And like Euphoria is dead in the water. And, you know, a lot of their TV shows have not panned out to do very well. So it is a big experimental period. I'd be really fascinated. Like, where is A24 in 3 years? I don't
Yeah.
know. Like, they're gonna have 2 movies nominated for Best Picture this year, most likely. Like that's better than the year prior. They had 1, so they're doing
Mm-hmm.
something right.
I think that the question that they're going to have to face, and not one that you and I have to have an answer for, is can they do both? Can they maintain the company that gets, you know, minimum 1 Best Picture nomination, has a bunch of players throughout the categories, and also have, you know, a $500 million grossing movie?
Yeah, they can, and I think they have to. The thing is, and I think this is a very shared sentiment among several people, that is like not new information. Their release strategy has not evolved at the pace that the film industry has evolved, that fans and viewers of movies have come to expect. They are still, and like again, this is where I find it very difficult to even try to answer and talk about, because like they did this last year with The Zone of Interest. They held it for release. They put it out in New York and LA. They made screeners possible at the Academy Museum for months. And then they released it generally publicly 8 weeks before the Academy Awards. It won. It won Best International Picture. It was nominated for Academy Awards. They're doing the same thing with The Brutalist this year. And I think a lot of the talk is, how come I can't see The Brutalist? How come I haven't been able to see Sing Sing? If I'm not in a designated market, it's been out for 10 months and I haven't been able to see it anywhere. What's going on with that? They're going to have to face those answers sooner or later, because the market is changing, and that cannot stick, in my opinion. And in 3 years, that release strategy, I don't think is going to work anymore. So what do you do about that? I think you do exactly what you said. I think they need to like find a stable of young creators, and I think your analogy was really good, actually. Like, use it as a sports team. Like, they got to get people onto like a multiple movie deal or contract and say, look, we want you to make 2 movies under our logo. We'll give you total creative control, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how they retain it, while they try to say, you know, how do we get somebody to make a massive action franchise under our label as well, and expect to make $600 million at the box office? They are just going to have to be smarter, in my opinion.
Yeah.
A24, not very smart right now.
Great at finding talent, not great at letting the rest of the world know what talent they have.
Yes, that is exactly correct.
All right. Well, we've been chatting for half an hour. I say we get into this movie here.
What went we out into this wilderness to find? Leaving our country, kindred, our fathers' houses. For what? For the kingdom of God. Let us pray.
The Witch was released in 2015 and was the directorial debut of Robert Eggers, who has since gone on to be one of the biggest names in horror. He followed up this film with another A24 film, The Lighthouse, before moving on to major studio to release The Northman, and coming out the same week as this podcast is his latest film, Nosferatu, an updated take on the 1922 German film. This is about a Puritan family who voluntarily excommunicates themselves from a New England plantation as the father William, played by Ralph Ineson, believes that the community to be false Christians. They find a patch of land near the woods where they begin to rebuild their life. One day, when the family's eldest child, Thomason, played by Anya Taylor-Joy, is playing peekaboo with baby Samuel, the baby disappears when she covers her eyes. We see a witch using Samuel to make a flying ointment as she rubs his blood on herself and broomstick. From there, the family begins to devolve into madness as the mother, Catherine, played by Kate Dickie, succumbs to grief over the loss of her child. Son Caleb, played by Harvey Scrimshaw, gets lured into a witch's hut before returning to the family possessed. And the youngest members of the family, twins Jonas and Mercy, supposedly are talking to the family's goat, Black Phillip, who tell them that Thomason is a witch. The Witch premiered at Sundance on January 23rd, 2015, with A24 and DirecTV buying the rights a few days later for a low amount in a little bit of competition. The film later played at TIFF, with the film getting a wide theatrical release and VOD release on February 19th, 2016. This is going to be a spoiler-filled episode, so if you've not watched the film, I suggest doing so first. I guess the first thing I want to ask you about, Ethan, is that recently on the Movie Draft podcast, you and your guest collaboratively ranked The Witch as the 8th best A24 horror film, a move that most of you claimed that you knew it needed to be on the list, but one that you all weren't very high on. I then was subjected to your co-host Ben Lawhorn deriding the film as boring, among other things. And I noticed in preparation for this episode, you yourself raised your rating from 2.5 stars to 4.5 stars on Letterboxd. So what changed for you? And if you redid the draft today, would you fight for the film to be higher up?
Yeah. Complicated history with The Lighthouse I do have. So this was my with The Witch. This is my third time seeing this film. The first two times, and I don't want to throw Ben under the bus here, but Ben, Ben is a persuasive guy. He's good with words, and I've been potting with him for 3+ years now. So there is inevitably some coercion that takes place. He was pretty out on the Witch. I should say exceptionally out on the Witch. And we covered it on the A24 pod. I rewatched it for the draft. And I was like, man, I think Ben's right. Like, I'm just not vibing with this movie. It's just not for me. And then I rewatched it for this pod after having seen a few of my mutuals log it on Letterboxd in preparation for Nosferatu, giving it 5 stars. And I was like, what is going on? Like, what am I missing about this film? I prepared myself. I said, okay, I'm going to watch The Witch tonight. That's what I'm going to do. Got to get in the right headspace. Turned off all the lights, flipped on The Witch. And 10 minutes in, I was like, oh, shoot, I was wrong. This movie's really, really good. This is really, really good. So I don't know quite exactly what I was thinking before, but like, it's probably my hardest pivot on a movie that I've had in some time. I would put The Witch higher than number 8 for sure. It's got to be in the top 5. It's hard because I hold a really special place for Midsommar and Hereditary. That draft did not go particularly how I had planned. I encourage people to go listen to that episode of the podcast, the Movie Draft podcast. But I would put The Witch quite high, at least in the top 5 for sure.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, those two directors, Eggers and Astor, the 4 films in particular, have such a foundational basis for what the A24 horror canon is. And I get this idea of, if you're trying to do a draft, you want to make sure you're including all the different types of horror that A24 has made, but it's so hard when 2 directors can possibly occupy 4 spots themselves. And 5 if you want to include Beau is Afraid.
Oh yeah, 100%. And it's interesting because, we speak about like A24 as a brand and kind of these origins. Eggers and Astor are like, those are the guys. Those are the A24 horror guys. Like, they have really prescribed what modern day horror can be. Obviously Jordan Peele is in this conversation as well, not part of the A24 brand. But it's interesting because, in my opinion, The Witch, The Lighthouse, Midsommar, Hereditary, all vastly different horror films and horror styles. And so to know that those are among 4 of the best A24 movies, it is very hard to draft and determine, like, what are the best A24 horror movies? Because, like, there's some deep cuts that are really good, and you don't really want to leave them out. But I think The Witch is very deserved of being very high in that conversation.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. And I think if you were to make some sort of a Mount Rushmore for most influential filmmakers to A24, whether or not you think they're the best or not, I think you'd have to include Eggers and Astor as the 1 and 2 spot.
Yeah, I think so. I think you really have to, because if you don't get them to make those movies, I'm not quite sure you can establish making other modern day, like newer films that are kind of in that vein. I don't know if you get like the green light to make the X trilogy. Like I don't know if A24 is interested in that world if they don't make those movies.
Yeah, no, that's completely fair. So what was it about the first few minutes as you're watching this movie, rewatching this movie, that really, grabbed you and said, hey, what was I missing before?
Well, I do think a large portion was subtitles. I think it's very helpful to watch this movie with.
Yes, I do want to talk about that, yes.
I really do think so. I think like truly engaging with the movie. Not to say that I'm disengaged when I watch films. I am now like very, very engaged. I put my phone on Do Not Disturb. I generally try to, give all of my attention to what I am watching. And I don't want to like sound pretentious, but I do think The Witch is like kind of a higher brow horror movie. Like I do think it takes a little bit more brain power. And I to the degradation of myself, like I just didn't have that brain power last time I watched it. Like I just didn't catch like, oh, this is about like the crippling powers of the patriarchy against feminism. Like I just didn't catch that last time. I was just like, cool, it's about a witch in the woods, I guess. And so like I just had a certain connection with it this time, especially in the beginning when we get the opening sequence of them leaving the colony. Even from that sequence, and it's very similar to me to I Saw the TV Glow, because I Saw the TV Glow kind of has a similar idea in the beginning where there is like a monologue and an event that kind of paves the path for what we're doing in the future of the film. When they leave their plot of land and their kind of people, I was like, oh, this is okay. So this is about religious outcasts, and this is about the foibles of human confidence, and this idea that all of that is tied up in like this core sin of humanity. I just think that I am better posed to understand that material now. It's very like literature adjacent because it is like a 1600s folk tale, and so I just think I was able to like grasp onto it a little bit better.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting, this idea of what religion plays in this movie too, because the whole, we would think of a movie like this or whatever it's the religious people kicking them out because they're not religious enough. But no, it's the complete opposite. This family willingly excommunicates themselves because they believe that the group around them are false Christians. And this sort of ties back to the whole like, first colonizers arriving in America, where we have all these stories that we hear, but in reality, they thought England wasn't religious enough for them. And they were like, screw you, we're going to create our own country where we could be as religious as we want. That's why they were Quakers. And they came to America to sort of, establish their own religion sort of thing. And that's sort of, I thought that was a great through line where this is what this family is. They are leaving England to go to America. The difference being they're already in New England and they're already in America. And then so much of this film, towards the end, we get the great sort of revelation of William being like, I was too prideful.
Yeah.
That was it. I was too prideful. I couldn't, he can't support his family alone. He can't hunt. He can't grow crops. They have to consider, selling their daughter off just so that way she doesn't die a miserable life out there with the rest of them. And that's their only hope.
Yeah. His story is so interesting in this movie because there is that inflection point where he does say like, I'm so prideful, this is my fault. And it's really easy to see that from the beginning, where you're just like, dude, you're just like getting stuck in, my guy. Like, just go back to the people.
Yeah.
And he wants to, but he also doesn't want to at the same time. He kind of plays this weird game. And his continual blaming of Thomason and his entire family for making his life go wrong is really interesting. And a huge part of like the main theme of this film is like, Thomason gets the brunt of everything, and this idea that like the devil didn't even choose her at first. She's like always this last option, which is really interesting. But like we get to the end and he crumbles under his chopped wood, which is just like the most heavy-handed thing that Eggers could have done that works incredibly successfully. Because we see
he's
him chopping wood
the
the whole
only thing
time.
that he's good at is chopping wood. Yeah,
and that is so brilliant. And like, there's a great, pretty short review on Ebert about The Witch, and it kind of mentions that how this movie tells you exactly where it's going to go the entire 90 minutes, but you're so raptured by it that you kind of don't get that until you get to the very end, and you're like, oh. Of course, we knew from the very start that this family would end up in a circumstance like this. It's not a surprise.
Yeah, and you're right about Thomason wasn't even the original one selected. Like the baby is stolen just because the witches need a baby, and then whether or not we choose to believe it, but I think we do have to believe that Jonas and Massey, as they keep calling them, I love it, are supposedly talking to Black Phillip, which, you know, if you want to believe he's the devil or whatever he is, or if he's just some sort of communique between the witches and the humans, however it is, they were talking to those children, not to Thomason. And it wasn't until basically everyone is dead that they're like, hey, you like butter? You want to try some butter?
I think my film literacy is much better now than it was even a year ago when I watched this, because like the end of this of like, would thou likes to live deliciously, I'm pretty sure I was like, oh, that's a sick line, but now I'm like, it's brilliant. It ties it together the entire film. Like, this is exactly what it has always been about. And Thomason especially was never going to be given the opportunity to live deliciously. And so that is very appealing to her. And like, to see her reach this release at the end of the film, that is of course a supernatural type of release, it kind of feels revelatory in the fact that it's like, I'm so happy for her. She got what she really ultimately was due and deserved. It just ended up costing her her soul and her family. Not a big deal, but you know, I guess you got to do what you got to do.
Yeah, because like, what would be the best case scenario for Thomason's life is that her parents sell her off to some middle class or rich family where she works as a servant until she's of marrying age, and then she just gets married off to whatever dude can afford to buy her from this other rich family.
Yeah, I mean, I was even going to say, like, you know, it's spoken of in this film of like, okay, we'll ride to these families. They'll have a need for Thomason. We'll sell her off. This will afford us, you know, money for the winter or whatever the case. And even in that case, it is a very prominent idea that Thomason has reached her womanhood in this film and is of age now. And I think it's a incredibly uncomfortable and fascinating theme and like little subplot of Caleb looking at Thomason. And I think there's a lot there too. But
it's about to become an unsafe environment for her just being at home.
Exactly. And like this crushing weight of being a young woman in a world like this. And if she is sold off, I'm positive she would, you know, become, unfortunately, probably sexually assaulted for many people in that family and many people around that family, and is ultimately sold off as a piece of meat that they can, you know, quench their desires with. So it's like really this flip side of like, would thou like to live deliciously? So now she gets the comeuppance at the end.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about subtitles, and that was something that you said helped you. Ralph Ineson, I absolutely adore his voice. He's got one of the greatest voices I've ever heard. But it basically is a sound effect. You can't understand this man talk in any role that he's in, really. And I know there's a lot of criticism to the way Christopher Nolan mixes his dialogue. But in this movie, literally, the way that they're speaking using this old form of English, the accents that they have, where it's this hybrid between colonial British accents with these new American accents, and the way Ralph Ineson speaks, without subtitles, this movie is basically incomprehensible.
Yeah, 100%. And that's really funny because my local rep theater showed The Witch for like their Sin Sunday series probably like 3 weeks ago, and I was like, should I go? Like maybe that could be fun. Like, could I go? I did not go, and then inevitably I watched it at home, and I was like, God, I'm so glad that I did not go because I would not have understood any portion of this film. I think he's really good and he's a really unique asset. I think he's like exceptional in The Green Knight, another A24 film. It'll be fascinating to see him as Galactus. I really wonder how the MCU is going to do that, and how they're going to make his voice perhaps a little easier to comprehend in such a like a vast piece of IP. Regardless, he is his accent, his presence, his physical stature is a complete necessity to this story. That is like a massive kind of lock and key for this movie. I don't think it works nearly as well if he is not in that role.
100%. Yeah. I completely agree. And I think I was maybe like 15 minutes in, and I was like, why don't I have the subtitles on for this? I put them on. I was like, now I know what they're saying.
Yeah, 100%.
Because they also, they conjugate verbs weirdly too, where they'll sort of leave out words in the sentence and it doesn't quite make sense, but if you're reading it, you can sort of fill in the gaps for yourself.
Yeah, it is a lot of like reading between
the
the lines for what they're saying, what they're alluding to. There is, I don't know if it's on purpose or if it's my brain getting tired towards the end of the film after like listening to that type of speech, but like it appears that at the end, really the final 20 minutes, his character in particular starts to, it feels a little more modern day, the way that he starts speaking. It's a little more crisp. It's a little bit more straight and narrow and less of this kind of colonized hyper-Christian type of speak. Regardless, I think that is a really smart stroke for the movie.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe he's just no longer speaking in Bible parables by the end because he realizes, once he admits to his sin, he can be himself again.
Yeah, tough
to
beat for our guy. Yeah, I mean, tough life being in this family. Got to be honest.
Yeah. What did you think of Anya Taylor-Joy's performance? This was her debut film and really exploded after this to be the star that we know she is today.
Yeah. I think it's kind of stupid that it's her debut film because she's really good. Like really good. And I'm bummed out that like this wasn't the first thing that I saw her in because obviously I'm exceptionally high on Furiosa. I think she's very good in The Menu. Like obviously she's really great in pretty much everything she does, even if the project is poor. I think there is something between her and Eggers that she can't really deliver in anything else. She's in The Green Knight, and I think she's like very similarly toned in The Green Knight, where she kind of has like this physical structure, especially like her face, where she can be dressed down to play in a period piece like this. That really makes sense. And I think that the scene in particular that cements her in this film is obviously like the creek by the brook, her saying that she is the witch of the woods to Mercy is really haunting stuff. And she's very, very good in this movie.
Yeah, I agree too. I don't know if this was the first thing I saw her in. Maybe it was. No, I think the first thing would have been, I'm looking over at her IMDb.
I think the first thing that I saw her in was the New Mutants. R.I.P. Tough for me.
I think it was Emma for me, a film I
Okay.
really adored, and then knew that she was also in The Witch. And I think during the COVID lockdowns, I caught up with both The Witch and Hereditary, and so catching up with that was pretty cool. It is funny looking at her and seeing just how young she looks in this. She was 19 when this movie came out. I assume she was probably 18 when she filmed it, but she looks so incredibly young in this film.
Yeah, she really does. And she plays that that role of the older sister that is like caught in between two worlds very, very well. She has this new movie coming up called The Gorge. I didn't watch the trailer for it, but I'm interested. I'm interested to say the least. I think I prefer Anya Taylor-Joy with blonde hair, but you know what? I'm willing to try her out with brunette hair in The Gorge.
Good. Okay. Yeah. I'm excited for that one too. I also have not watched the trailer for it yet, but it sounds interesting from what little I do know about it. What else do we want to talk about here? Let's talk about how scary do you find this film? Because for me, compared to, it's going to be impossible to not talk about Hereditary and Midsommar as well. Eggers doesn't really have the traditional scary movie style. The Lighthouse, also a horror movie that doesn't feel very scary. I think there's really only one moment in this where it kind of jolts me, and it's near the end when Black Phillip gores William.
Oh, yeah.
I always forget about that bit where, like, I know it's coming, but then, like, when he, like, shocks him by stabbing him with his horns, that's the one time that I was like, oh my God, that kind of spooked me there. Other than that, there isn't really a scary moment in this movie for me. What about for you?
Totally agree with you. I think that's like the one moment that I'm like really scared, like a true jump scare. I think this movie is more haunting than scary. I think what this movie does really smartly is that it is essentially 85 minutes of a buildup of like, this isn't going to end well. Or like, here,
Yes.
like where things are going to end poorly. And of course, we get the right before that big Black Phillip scene happens, probably 10 minutes before it happens, is when William does lock them all up. He boards them all up outside with the animals. And that is kind of like the turning point where like, okay, we're gauging a little bit more towards a true horror here. Things can go poorly, but it's still ridiculously haunting instead of like actually scary. I don't think this movie, like, that's a hard thing when I think of like, oh, it's a good scary movie. I don't think of The Witch. When I think of like what's a really dark movie, I think of The Witch, because it is like so subtextual and obviously deals with Satan or whoever you want to attribute Black Phillip to be, and is more creepy, I would say, than ultimately scary, but it's more effective to me than a true scary movie.
Yeah, there's a couple really unsettling moments. I think of also kind of near towards the end when the mother is having the nightmare about seeing her children, and then we see the reveal and it's a crow pecking at her breast.
That's sick, man.
That's a pretty unsettling moment, but like not something that like is outright terrifying. It's just like, oh, that's really nasty, and like understanding the headspace that she has devolved into to lead her to this sort of madness.
Yeah, and of course, the scene with Caleb and like kind of his possession / reawakening, I think is pretty scary, but I think it's more intriguing than anything because it is a direct thematic reference, obviously, to everything he's talked about with his father being in the woods. He kind of coughs up an apple, this idea of like the purest form of sin in man. And the way that Caleb like disappears in the woods with the witch kind of taking the form of this very beautiful Red Riding Hood figure is really interesting. And like every time I watch it, I am intrigued by Caleb's story. I think the most as like a young boy who is trying to come to grips with, okay, I'm supposed to be forgiven of my sins, but I still am learning how religion works and how God works and all of these ideas. I also am a young boy that like I beauty. What are you going to do? And like, that's how he ends up going. I think is really dark and demented. And it really speaks to like the inability of man to break themselves free of any like overt, I guess like destiny that is out of their hands. Like that's just how it goes sometimes for people.
Yeah. Yeah. Because Caleb definitely seems to be a boy that's on the verge of beginning puberty. And, it's things like the way he sort of looks at his sister, which makes the viewer feel very uncomfortable. But, other than his mother, it's probably the only female that he's seen in a year or two. which sort of like gives you very like creepy undertones of like, how is this boy gonna grow
Yeah.
up? And then when he sees this, very attractive witch, you're like, I understand why he's, feels comfortable walking up to her. He looks scared, but he's still entranced by her beauty.
Yeah. I mean, look, I can't fault Caleb. If I were in Caleb's shoes, you probably wouldn't see him again. It's a pretty beautiful witch, so I get it.
All right. Is there anything that you want to hit on that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet?
Not in particular. I do think that let's see, Kate Dickie in this movie is really good. And I think she's unbelievably underrated in this film. I think it's really an interesting thing because it's kind of like a three-hander plus the boy who plays Caleb, like has a little bit of juice in there, but it really is a three-hander between Anya Taylor-Joy, Ralph Ineson, and Kate Dickie. She, I feel like, is the most telltale sign of where William and Thomason are headed, and they just haven't gotten there yet, but it's coming for everybody. And her constant kind of prescription of like, God will absolve us of these sins, God is here among us, like we just need to pray, is someone that grew up in an ultra religious household that doesn't really practice religion anymore, is haunting to me, because like I get that makes sense to people like that, and like for her to then kind of turn into what she does, I think is really creepy. The Witch, good movie though, I will say, really good movie.
Yeah, continuing with the Kate Dickie thing, I feel like we get a lot of insight into her character, reading between the lines of, this was a woman that probably didn't want to leave England. She talks about, what can her husband do to fix the problem? And she's like, I want to be back. And he's like, oh yeah, the plantation, we'll go back. And he's like, no, I want to be back in England. Like, this was probably a woman who, we can figure that Thomason would be on a similar path, where she was very young, probably married off at a young age, had a whole bunch of kids, and then her husband's like, this place isn't religious enough for us. We need to go to America where we can be ourselves. And she was like, but my family is here. The people I grew up with is here. My support structure is here. I won't know anyone over there. And he's like, no, we'll make it in America. And I feel like Kate Dickie does a really good job of, portraying someone who has never gotten over that, and just every time something bad happened, it's just compounding the grief.
Yeah, and it's a really bold through line for Thomason's character as well, but like this idea, this overarching theme and idea of the oppression of like the male dominated space, especially in this period of time, of like they were just along for the ride, and they were just going to go wherever William went, and they were just going to do whatever William did. And like that is pretty degrading and depressing, and that is her life. And what it took for her to get to a stage where she calls William out and is like, I can't believe you would lie to me, I can't believe you would do this, is after one of her children have already gone missing. The second one is actively missing, and like things have really tumbled much farther than it should have for her to even kind of speak out. The very last thing I want to note is the subplot about the silver cup and Thomason taking the blame for that, and how William doesn't speak up. And then, of course, Kate Dickie's character finds out about this. Caleb doesn't really speak up. Like, again, tough beat for Thomason here. Just getting the brunt of everything in this family.
Yeah. And of course, once you put up with that much abuse, the idea of being able to be offered to have any earthly pleasure you want. That sounds pretty appealing.
Yeah, absolutely. And like in her eyes, free of charge. Like she doesn't need to appeal to Black Phillip to make him happy to then get rewarded.
Yeah.
Like she does her father. She just gets it given to her. She just has to sign the book. Pretty easy. Even though she can't write her name.
Yeah. Yeah. So this movie takes place about 90 years before the Salem witch trials, and I think it's absolutely in Robert Eggers' mind of deciding to set this, because you can sort of see where you'll get isolated cases like this where someone will be accused of witchcraft, which will eventually lead to the hysteria that becomes the Salem witch trials. And like, I'm not super knowledgeable about that era. there's plays like The Crucible that do a really great job of kind of catching people up on a modern lens of that take of how women were being oppressed. But I don't think it was any sort of mistake that Eggers decided to place this just before the Salem witch trials were starting, because this would be sort of a catalyst for what would come later.
Yeah, 100%. I think Eggers is one of the few, and I'm probably blanking on a few other people, but like one of the few people that can successfully and smartly do a period piece like this. I know when he released The Northman, that was like a lot of the talk was like, oh, you did a historical deep dive for months and months and months to get this right and to care about Vikings and this world and this time. So I think he is the kind of guy that's like, hey, it has to be this because of the things either prior or post. And he does so very, very successfully. I'm excited to see Nosferatu. I haven't seen it yet, unfortunately. I gotta watch it with the general public, but I think that is another kind of movie that signifies his strengths in how he does that.
Yeah, I don't think there's ever been a director pairing with a source material that I've been more excited about than Eggers doing Nosferatu. Like, does that not sound like the match that needed to happen eventually?
It sounds incredible. And I'm gonna really make listeners mad here, and maybe you. I've never watched a single piece of like Nosferatu content. I've never seen the film. I've never seen anything regarding it at all. So I have opted to go into this movie completely blind. I have no reference point. I have no idea of like, oh, hey, that's referencing the original movie, or like, hey, I recognize that. I'm just taking it for what Eggers' vision is. And I'm ridiculously excited. It seems like a perfect kind of narrative for him to take on.
Yeah. A couple years ago for my Halloween special, I did a Nosferatu special. So I
nice.
covered the original 1922 version. And then in the 70s, Werner Herzog made his version, which is absolutely incredible. Both are incredible masterpieces. And then in the 90s, there was a movie called Shadow of the Vampire, there's this theory that the original actor who played Nosferatu wasn't an actor. He was actually a vampire. So they decided to make a movie about this idea with Willem Dafoe playing the titular vampire. And so it's great that he's back in Nosferatu because it just sort of ties his whole career together.
Yeah, I'm stoked. I plan to watch all of those things after I see Nosferatu and just do a full.
I'm very excited to hear your thoughts on them.
I think before I go see Nosferatu, now that I've seen The Witch, I do think I'm going to rewatch The Lighthouse and The Northman, just so I get a full like Eggers slate going into Nosferatu, which I'm pretty excited about because I haven't seen The Northman since seeing it in theaters a couple of years ago. So I'm long overdue for a rewatch.
Where do you stand on The Northman from your memory, yay or nay?
Oh, I'm so pro. I'm super pro The Northman.
Oh, yes.
I think that movie is awesome, and I don't think people give it enough credit at all. Hopefully I don't flip on it, hopefully I don't flip on it like I did The Witch. Hopefully I'm not like, oh man, not as good as I remember. But I own the 4K of The Northman. I'm very excited to pop it in one of these nights.
Yeah, I got to definitely rewatch that one too. It's great. All right, well, I think that was a great place to end on our discussion on The Witch, but now let's do our double bill pairing. So if you can pair any movie for people to watch with The Witch that is not an A24 film, what would you choose and why?
Okay, so, excuse me. So I was really debating between two films for this. And I think I'm going to go with the more horror of them, but I will give you an honorable mention. So my honorable mention was going to be a movie that I am very like recency pilled on. Movie that I saw in theaters for the first time. I've seen it before. I was going to pair it with Eyes Wide Shut because I'm like, okay, The Witch is about this, the power of the patriarchy getting women down, getting young women down, not utilizing their power. Eyes Wide Shut, kind of the inverse of that through a psychological thriller lens. Like Nicole Kidman really enacts this power of the hold that a woman has on a relationship, especially the sexual components of a relationship. And I thought that was an interesting dynamic. I guess you could also say, similar to Baby Girl that's coming out. That is very much in that vein. But I'm actually going to pick a more horror-focused one because I think it takes that idea that The Witch puts out for Anya Taylor-Joy's character and it is still kind of a period piece. I think it takes place in the 90s, but it is a movie from this year. I'm going to pair it with The First Omen. This is a prequel to the 70s Omen. This one done by Arkasha Stevenson. And basically my thought process is like Neil Tiger Free, who plays Margaret, like the titular character of this movie, is basically beaten down by the system and is like, yo, you got to birth this demon. You got to birth evil. This is what you have to do. You have to do it for the church. You have to do it for the world. You have to do it for a religion. So we kind of had that big thematic religious tie between The Witch and The First Omen. And then in the end, I think if you watch The Witch first, you do get that little bit of a release with Anya Taylor-Joy's character, but it is unfortunately under the veil of like, wow, a lot of maybe not under the best circumstances. Maybe her future doesn't look so bright. And then when you get to the end of The First Omen, you're like, wow, really intense. And it kind of elevates that idea of this kind of physical freedom of what has taken place throughout the entire film. And yeah, I like The First Omen. I think it's quite a good film. So I think that'd be a fun double bill.
Nice. That is a movie that is high on my watch list for. I'm trying to catch up on all my 2024 movies, and that is up there that I keep trying to get
Nice.
to. So this is just giving me even more reason to do so.
Yeah, I recommend it for sure. It's a little on the long side. It's 119 minutes, but it is worth it. It is definitely one of the more interesting movies of 2024, and I think a great step for the horror genre. Which, you know, picking a movie from this year as a double bill might be a little bit of a cop out, but I feel really good about it.
Nice. Okay. So for me, I was want to do another folk horror movie, and I was thinking about different ones, and there's a couple classic ones. Blood on Satan's Claw and The Witchfinder General are two that jumped out to me first. I was like, oh yeah, I really like both of those movies. But what about, are there any other folk horror ones I want to talk about? And then I realized that I'm gonna cheat by naming a documentary called Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, which was my introduction really to folk horror. It is an almost 4-hour documentary that basically traces the entire origins of folk horror on film in almost every movie that has been made in that genre. And there's a letterbox list that lists all 223 movies that are mentioned by name in this documentary, and it's basically a scholarly text about folk horror that is so fascinating. It was basically an inspiration for I think it's I can't remember what boutique label it is, but they've now put out 2 box sets of folk horror movies strictly because of this documentary. The first one includes the original documentary as well. So if people are interested in movies like The Witch and Midsommar and anything that's folk horror related, check out Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, A History of Folk Horror.
Wow.
Amazing stuff.
I have just added to my watch list. It looks like you can stream it on Amazon Prime right now. So
amazing.
Yeah. Check that out. I'm going to watch it. It sounds incredible.
It's something that, like, yeah, if you watch it and break it up like you're watching like a mini series, it's a lot more digestible and easy, because they do kind of, you know, tackle different eras and subgenres and things like that. So it's kind of easy to pause and come back to it. But if you watch this, you're gonna end up filling up your letterbox watch list of trying to add all the different stuff that sounds fascinating.
That's the one thing I need in my life. I need my watch list to be longer. It's not long enough already.
Don't we all, right? All right, Ethan, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure. Really appreciate you coming on and talking A24 and sharing all your knowledge and insights. It was a lot of fun today.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me on the show. This was a blast. I hope that, you know, if there's anybody out there that is out on The Witch, I hope you give it another shot like I did. Try again, because The Witch is very, very, very good. But yeah, thanks for having me on the show, man. This was a pleasure.
Hell yeah. Well, where can people find your work and what do you have going on?
Yeah, I am primarily on Twitter these days. You can follow me there at Ethan Simi. I have a TikTok for as long as TikTok exists, so we'll see if that's the case. And I have a YouTube channel. You can just search my name, Ethan Simi, on YouTube. It's also under the name Movies Are So Back. I'm putting out movie reviews, trailer reactions. I have some fun lists coming up of movies that I'm most excited for in 2025. So those would be the main places that you can find me. That is pretty much what I have going on in my life right now. Just trying to gear up for 2025, trying to predict, what's going to happen for the 2025 Oscars, 2024 Oscars. So that occupies a lot of my brain space because I tinker with that every day. So it's a blast. Yeah, it's good times over here.
One of us.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, awesome. I'll make sure to link to all of that in the show notes for people to find out. This has been a That Shelf podcast. Visit thatshelf.com for more great film discourse. Follow the show on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at ContraZoomPod. What are your thoughts on The Witch? Leave a comment on Spotify or send us an email. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well. And if you really like the show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.